Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the GRC and Cybersecurity Podcast. In today's episode, we had a very special guest, James Green. We talk about setting up his resiliency think tank, tabletop exercise, and all things resilience. Hi James, can you introduce yourself to the listeners and tell a little bit about the company you work for and what it does?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. My name is James Green. I am based in the United States, and I currently run two companies. The first is the Resilience Think Tank. I'm one of the global co-founders. We founded the think tank in 2021 to provide independent guidance and research to the risk and resilience industry. I am also one of the co-founders of Illuminate Advisory. We are a boutique risk and resilience consulting firm.
Fantastic. Before we go any further, one of the things I always like to ask is, what do you get up to outside of work? Any hobbies, interests that you'd like to tell listeners about?
Yeah, absolutely. I have two children, both boys. They're 17 and 19. One is in his first year in university. The other is about to start his first year in university. They keep me pretty busy. I love to travel. My wife and I love to travel, and I like to play tennis.
Fantastic. So, what is your role, and can you give us a bit of an understanding of how you got into security and resilience? What was your pathway?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, I lead or co-founded two different companies, and I really fell into our space. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that publicly, but the first half of my career, I was in financial services, and it was 2008, and my company had just been sold, and everyone was laid off, and the economy was falling apart, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do next, and I got a call from a friend of mine, and he said, "Hey, I know this organization that is looking for somebody. They want someone really outside of the box for business continuity." And I said, "Well, I'm outside the box because I don't even know what you're talking about." And I spent a month prepping for that interview. And this company had gone through 4 business continuity leaders in 4 years. And they just really felt the people they had didn't have a business background. They had an IT background, they had a tech background, but they didn't have somebody who they felt could build relationships. And I ended up getting that job. And I was so certain that I was going to get fired immediately because I had very minimal qualifications that I had to relocate for the job. And I took an apartment on a month-to-month lease. And about a week and a half in, we had our first crisis management incident, had to activate the crisis management team. And I loved it. And I've been in the space ever since.
Amazing. So, I guess one of the things that you said there is you joined the industry and you went into industry. How did that evolve into your current role then? So you were in continuity for 4 or 5 years in that role, and then that's evolved into the think tank. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was originally a practitioner. So I've led global business continuity and crisis management programs for global companies, for financial services companies. And then around 2017, I went to the dark side of consulting. I've worked for vendors, I've worked for consulting companies, and then I'm a risk taker myself. I like to take risk. And in 2021, it was actually my wife who's like, "What, you should go out on your own." And you talk a big game. Can you actually do this on your own? And I did, and we're still here. We're still alive and thriving, which is exciting for Illuminate Advisory. And then the Resilience Think Tank just came about by a friend of mine, Mark Hoffman, who's based in Toronto, Canada. And he just kind of recognized, there's a lot of gaps in our industry, not in terms of technical training or certification, but really, how do we strengthen resilience professionals, and how do we shine a spotlight on people who aren't me, who aren't middle-aged white men in the United States? Resilience is a global profession. What are we doing in different parts of the world? What are we doing for younger people, for people who come into the industry at a later stage in their career? And that's kind of how the Resilience Think Tank started.
And how, just so I can get a size and scale, how many members have you got at this point in time?
Yeah, so we just launched our membership model in September. So we originally, our goal was, can we create quality content? And then the key is, can we be consistent? So you and I have seen podcasts pop up, and we've seen webinar series pop up, and all these things. And I've been a part of things that are flash in the pan and they're amazing for a month. We really wanted to see first, can we do this for 2 years? Can we prove to ourselves and to the world that we're going to do this consistently? We're going to have high quality. We're going to get good feedback. And so we sat on launching a membership model, basically as a long-term proof of concept. We wanted to make sure we got this right. And I think right now we have, I want to say 50 members or so after a few months, but most excited by how many members we have in countries outside of the United Kingdom and the United States. So a lot of people in different parts of the world, which we're very excited to be working with.
It's great because you can learn things from different practices in different countries. You get other regulatory insights because there's going to be all kinds of different organizations that are facing different things based on where they are.
Yeah, and we learn something new every week. Once a month, we host an Ask Me Anything, and one of our members was in Cuba. I'm not sure if it was for work or holiday, but I got a message from them like, hey, I can't access Zoom in Cuba, which is not something I ever would have thought of, that there are certain countries in the world that, there's different, telecommunication restrictions. So
we always do a bit of a specialist subject. We'd obviously discussed before tabletop exercises. So
yes.
do you mind explaining to the listener what is a tabletop exercise and why is it so important?
Absolutely. So I love tabletop exercises. I actually teach a class called The Best Tabletop Exercise in the World, very modestly titled. But a tabletop exercise for me is, we are going to test our resilience capability. It's one thing to have a plan and a very robust plan. And honestly, lots of companies don't even have plans. But what happens when something happens, when there's that bump in the night? What is our capability? So a tabletop exercise is just simply getting people into a conference room or on a Zoom or on a Teams call, and we're going to walk through a realistic scenario and see how we do. It's not meant to be an audit. It's not pass or fail. Like a lot of times people think, oh, the goal is so we never have any issues and then there's no value there, or we make everyone cry and there's probably not any value there. It's just to kind of see where we are and can we help the group kind of stretch their capabilities a little bit.
Yeah, and I guess it's one of those things like, if you didn't find anything, you're probably doing it wrong because it's never going to be perfect, right?
Absolutely. Then let's just check the box. Then let's just send everyone an email and save everyone time.
Yeah, we ran we ran the exercise. It's fine. We checked. We ran through it. It all made sense. It's kind of like, well, we probably need to interact with the stakeholders, make sure. Yeah,
exactly. Then there's no value there. Then just send an email update. Here's where we're at.
So, what are some of the pitfalls? So, when people run these, what mistakes do you often see so that they don't get the value that you were talking about here?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this. So the first thing is, do you have the right exercise for the audience? And so if you and I are doing a tabletop exercise with a board of directors, the goal and the decision making should be strategic. Your board of directors is not going to come down and run payroll during an incident. And the same thing is, if we're at that department level, then the goal and focus should be tactical. Again, our account, you and I are in accounts payable. We don't get to decide direction companies moving in or how we're going to maybe rebuild or respond to ransomware. It's how do we do our specific process. So that's the first mistake I see. And then the second is not knowing the goal going into the exercise. Dale Carnegie talked about begin with the end in mind. So what is the goal of the exercise? Is it to find the right people to lead during a crisis? Because a lot of times we see people are put on a crisis management team and honestly, they don't work well together. or they don't work well under pressure. And if you're stressing out at 9 a.m. on a Monday on a conference call, what are you going to do Thursday at 3 in the morning when there's a literal fire or when you've had ransomware? Or are we trying to create awareness for our programs? We run a lot of exercises for companies that don't have any type of business continuity or crisis management or even crisis communication program, because you take the abstract and you make it real. If I can spend an hour with your leadership team and go through an exercise, you're going to come out of that hopefully and say, oh, wow, we do need some type of framework here or some type of structure.
So, what are some of the strategies for keeping people engaged? So, you said these events, they might take quite a long time, especially depending on the scenario you're testing. But
yeah,
how do you make sure that people think at the end of it, yeah, we got a lot of value. This wasn't a waste of time?
So the first strategy is, how long is that exercise? Again, if you have your C-suite and you put a 6-hour meeting invite on their calendar, here's what's going to happen. Half are going to decline immediately. And then probably the rest, or the 2/3 of the rest, when that meeting reminder pops up 15 minutes out that says, oh, you have a meeting with James from 9 to 3, you're just not showing up. So you really have to manage in this day and age, and we've seen them get shorter and shorter and shorter. We don't have long attention spans now. Like, we're on TikTok, we're on Instagram. So the first thing is, know your audience, know the length of time. And then another big thing is be realistic with the scenario, but not repetitive. I live in Florida. We have hurricanes. I would think most companies here know what they're going to do during a hurricane, but yet we still see companies, they run a hurricane tabletop exercise every year. There's no value there. We know what to do. And then I want to have some fun. Like, we are still people first. Exercises don't need to be boring. I'm not saying they should be silly. I'm not going to show up in a clown outfit. But if you treat people like humans first, they'll stay engaged. And the last thing we think about is we want to have some injects. We want to have some wrinkles along the way, because that's how a real crisis happens. When a crisis first happens, we don't know everything at once, and we probably have bad information. And so we're gonna make decisions on bad information. Then we're gonna get better information. So then we change our models. But we also, I see like a lot of people go the other way, where it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. So again, I have an hour and a half, and I've got 38 gotchas in there. People just get frustrated. Think about if you're watching a thriller or a mystery movie, and if there's 15 plot twists, you just tune out.
Yeah, you lose kind of that thing, though. You lose the thread, and you're like, where's this going? And
so think of if you like M. Night Shyamalan or some of his great movies like The Sixth Sense or Unbreakable, if there was a plot twist every 4 minutes, you're probably getting up and leaving the theater because it's convoluted. But we see a lot of people do that with their exercises. Oh, there's a fire. Then there's ransomware. Then there's Godzilla. Then Matt has conducted industrial espionage. Now, it gets so convoluted, people just tune out.
And you've led straight on to my next question, is like, how do you make sure they're realistic? So can you talk through some examples of how you'd go about making sure that actually it is realistic and it's not got Godzilla walking around in the middle of it?
Well, the first thing I ask is, have you guys had an incident in the last 24 months besides COVID? And that gives me some indication. Not that we want to do an exercise of what just happened, but what has happened here? Hey, we just got hit by ransomware, or we did experience a flood and have some issues. Where are we based geographically? Are we concentrated? Are we dispersed? So just kind of looking around where the people are, where the business is, and where, follow the money. If we're a for-profit, where do we make most of our revenue? Let's focus in on scenarios there. If we're a nonprofit, what is our mission? What part of the community do we serve? Let's focus in on that. So that realism comes from, is it accurate and is it relevant?
And how often would you run one, and what kind of time? How long would you run them for? I mean, just to have interest.
Yeah. So like I said, my typical tabletop exercise these days is 90 minutes, because I find I can't get people in a room longer than that, honestly. And it depends on the culture of the company. Now, if I'm with a defense contractor or public sector organization, government organization, they're used to sitting in a room all day. But us private sector folks, we're not. So I find that sweet spot. 90 minutes is long enough to, assess our strengths and weaknesses, understand where we need to go, and maybe, tease out some next steps.
And is it good for people to do pre-planning, or would you rather them come into it fairly cold? They're
I don't really like pre-planning, because we don't have something on our calendar that says we're going to hit by ransomware Thursday at 4 p.m. So, and in my experience, if there's an incident, Matt, your first response is not usually going to be, "Oh, let me go grab that 3-ring binder because I know there's a Godzilla scenario in chapter 12, page 6." So I want people to know that there's a tabletop exercise happening. Again, if you surprise people right in the beginning, "Hey, Matt, get on this call right now," and you're in with your C-suite, I never want to make anyone look bad. We never want to embarrass anyone. But part of that realism is, when there's that bump in the night, you generally don't know ahead of time that it's like, "Oh, I'm going to get woken up at 2 a.m. because of this bad thing."
So, how do you measure the effectiveness of a tabletop exercise? How do you make sure that you're getting value out?
Yeah. So the first thing is, in the planning, we want to make sure we're relevant to the business. So I love to ask management, what keeps you up at night? Is the first question. And then again, looking at that, if we're a nonprofit, what is our mission and value? And if we're a for-profit, where do we make most of our money? So I want to keep it relevant and valuable based on those. And then the second thing is one of the simplest things, but we also see people miss them, is conduct an after action review, right? Gather people's feedback. What did they like? What did they not like? What do we need to improve? What are our strengths? And then the key is actually do something with the findings of that after action review. I never understand. We spent all this time, taking in everybody's input, and Matt said this and James said this and this person said that, and then it just gets buried. You're telling people that their opinion doesn't matter, or that this is just kind of a check the box type of scenario. But if you follow up and you say, "Okay, Matt said we needed to do this thing, and he said he'd do it by May 30th," and you follow up, and then you come back to the group and say, "Hey, here were the 4 issues we had. We remediated those 4 things. Here's those 3 or 4 things that are still open." The next time you do an exercise, people are going to know, "Oh, hey, James respected my time and we took action on this. So it's actually worth my time to be involved, to speak up, and because we're seeing how we're mitigating risk for our company."
And what are some of the strategies to make sure people collaborate in these exercises and they're not kind of, as you said before, you've got people arguing and it's not working? How do you ensure that, or at least try and guide it that way?
Yeah, so in most organizations, a lot of people have their little fiefdom, and this is my area, and this is what matters to me. And so you want to incorporate some of those things if they're relevant to the business. Now, you're always going to have that one person who says, like, as an absurd example, "The printer on my desk. We need a BC plan for the printer on my desk, and that the whole company will stop if I don't have a printer." Well, no, you can probably go without paper for a couple of days. But a lot of time there are interests that are business interests. And so we want to align our risk management strategies and our exercises to those interests. And I think that's that's a big miss. Because if I know, Matt, you support a business unit that is a key driver for either revenue or our mission, and I bring that into our exercise, guess who's immediately interested in what we're doing is Matt. And then the other thing is to identify those key stakeholders. And I'm not talking about just the org chart. We naturally look at the top of the org chart. Who's the C-suite? Oh, those are the most important people in the company. But that's not usually true. There's usually someone somewhere, and we can all ask, like, who's important here? And be like, oh, well, James is a guy who was here pre-acquisition, and he knows where all the skeletons are, and he knows, like, there's always that person who may not have a title to designate importance, but they're really important to the company. That's like that hidden stakeholder, and we want to incorporate them. I want them as a participant or as an observer, or giving me background on the quality and realism of the exercise.
Yeah, you always have those in companies with technology where there's always someone who's, oh, that person who's worked on this old finance system or this thing that we use for our finance system who's been here for years. And you're like,
exactly.
All right, so if that person isn't here, can we run this? Like, oh, no, we can't. You're like, oh.
Yeah, we talk about technology debt all the time. But to your point, who's the person who knows how to run that finance system?
The one we've had 15 exceptions for that we're going to upgrade for the last 10 years and everyone's been ignoring it.
Exactly. I want that person in the room.
Amazing. One of the things that I did want to ask is, so obviously these changes in the US with the SEC's cyber incidents and having to report them, do you think that's going to affect in any way how people treat continuity and resilience? Because they're going to have to disclose it and what they did.
Yes, absolutely. So we have done more cybersecurity-based tabletop exercises in the U.S. in the last 12 months than I have in the rest of my career. Now, obviously, the main driver of that is ransomware. So when you ask me about what's a realistic scenario, I would think almost any organization in the world, ransomware is a realistic and very valid scenario. But to your point, now that public companies have to disclose something, there are now regulatory ramifications with that, but there's also legal ramifications, because if we run a public company in the United States and we don't disclose on time, we're going to get fined by the SEC, but then we're also going to get sued by our shareholders, our stockholders. It's going to change the game. And I have a lot of organizations now are like, wait, we have to publicly disclose, or I'm the CEO, I have to put my name on something. They're very much in tune now, where I think we've kind of seen this cycle where a company's website goes down, and what's the first thing they say? Oh, we had an upgrade overnight and it's a server issue. And then they come out and step two is like, oh, well, our patching failed. And then down the line, they're like, oh, yeah, our bad. We got hit by ransomware. I'm hoping that this regulatory requirement drives more transparency. It's certainly not going to stop ransomware, but it'd be nice as a customer of a company, as a stakeholder of a company, to know ahead of time, or just be honest and transparent, as opposed to a migration, an upgrade. It seems like there's this playbook of how to obscure what really happened.
All the time, don't you? There's always this kind of thing where you're like, oh right, yeah, that upgrade happened, and you're like, come on. Everyone looks at it and goes, doesn't really pass the smell test anymore, does it?
Exactly. I don't understand how upgrading your marketing database knocks your entire website offline.
Exactly.
So,
because one of the things I went to FairCon last year where they were talking, and they had a person from the SEC and a lawyer who represents, because one of the interesting things with that new regulation is it doesn't tell you what material is. So there's this now really difficult thing where it's like, they're probably going to start disclosing a lot more than they ever did before, because if it's a change in the share price, it doesn't take a lot for the share price to change. And the SEC are not saying, "Oh, this is what materiality is." They're saying it's for up to you to determine what materiality is, which is an interesting approach because it's like it's probably going to force people to say, "Oh, well, this happened," which you probably didn't even get before because it maybe wasn't even the website going down.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if over time, though, materiality is defined,
Yeah,
because you're going to have a company push into that gray zone and say, well, we have PII for 100 million people. So to us, 5 million people is not material. Or our revenue is $40 billion. So we paid a $500 million ransomware. That's immaterial. I would like to think that, like you, companies will overshare,
yeah.
but I have a feeling most companies are very defensive and kind of hold things tight. So
It
we'll
could be the
wait to see
first
that.
one who gets the fine, isn't it? I mean, it could be to see what the fines are if they start holding people legally liable, and then I guess then people will
Yeah.
probably go, right, we probably need to overshare for a while, and then I guess it just depends how it all plays out, isn't it?
Yeah, that first fine is always the litmus test. So when the EU passed GDPR, everyone was waiting. Okay, who's going to get fined? How much money is it? What are we talking about? And you look at Facebook and some other companies; those fines were substantial.
Yeah,
And then the companies who didn't take it seriously now. And to your point, I think the same thing's going to happen here. You can't have a company get a slap on the wrist for not disclosing. It's got to be significant so that boards and C suites are like, oh, this has teeth to it, and so we need to be proactive and mindful with this.
so shifting on from the tabletop stuff, I really appreciate it. Great overview of tabletops, but what are your biggest area of concerns over the next 12 months?
Yeah, so I think the first is so being based in the United States, the 2024 election cycle here is going to be very interesting and polarizing, regardless of the results. But wider than that, there are 60 countries that have significant elections this year. So it's kind of like, which way are the winds blowing politically, not just in the United States, but globally. That really drives business, that drives security and privacy laws. I think we have um, this inflection point this year that there could be a lot of changes to how we run businesses, to how we run governments, to how we run a lot of things based on what happened over the next 8 months. The other thing I really find interesting is that I feel like there's this eradication of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion programs in the corporate sector. So, especially here in the United States, after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, there was this very large response of, hey, we need to be more inclusive. We need to have more diverse voices and faces in the room. And now that's being kind of stripped away. Lisa Jones, a friend of mine, was sharing with me that over the last 12 months, D&I positions have been reduced at a rate fivefold over any other position in the economy. So it's not just an economic thing, but I worry, are we going to take steps back even further than where we've been? And now it's become in North America, very much DEI has become a political word and term. It reminds me similar of how maybe the words climate change were triggering for people 5-10 years ago. Now DEI is used as something that's negative. And, that kind of makes me sad, because the goal of these programs is to be inclusive of people who have been overlooked in the past. It's not taking away my seat at the table. It's adding seats to the table. And we've seen tremendous backlash with that thought process the last 6 months.
Yeah, and one of the things I think we started to see was in the UK. It's not. I don't think it's a legal requirement, but I could be wrong. Is people disclosing it in their annual reports of things like what is the ratio of male to female, specific people in levels of management and other things, which doesn't feel like a bad thing to be disclosing anyway. Like it feels like you should be at least publishing where you are on these programs and what you're doing. Because look, it's not going to get fixed overnight, but if it's ignored and you're not reporting it, ultimately people are not going to see it. They're not going to see what the current state is, because in a lot of cases people are just going, oh, it's not that important. But if you look at maybe some of the raw numbers, it makes people think a lot more.
Correct. You can't argue with data. And large companies in the United States have always had to collect data on applicants and employees, for different categories. And like you said, does your management team look and reflect what your organization does? Does your organization reflect the community you're in? I just feel that makes your company more resilient and stronger. And we see that a lot of times in a crisis. If we've got an unconventional crisis, which I would argue everything in the last 4 years has been unconventional, and I've got 5 people in the room and they all have the same point of view, they're all going to come up with the same solution. And if that solution doesn't solve our problem, excuse my language, we're screwed. You want Matt to have a very different solution and idea than James, than everyone else, because then collectively, that's how we solve a problem. That's how we manage a crisis.
So, what do you think the key skills are? If you're hiring someone for a continuity or resilience role, what are the key skills you look for in that person?
So the first thing is I want them to be adaptable, because what makes your organization resilient is completely different than what makes my organization resilient. And what works in your old company will not work in my new company. So again, talking about some of the companies we've talked about earlier, if I work with a defense contractor as a company, I know they're very hierarchical and they have a chain of command. And that's how they operate day to day. And so that's how they operate during a crisis. But if we've got a company in Silicon Valley where there's beer on tap and there's a ping pong table and we're very collaborative, and during an emergency, someone stands up and says, I'm in charge. Like you're going to be asked to leave. So you've got to adapt your program to the business, and they've got to be able to adapt their program as the business changes. So again, 5 years ago, how many of us were ordering takeaway on an app to be delivered to our house? Not many. And how many now? A huge percentage. So if you and I did business continuity and resilience for a restaurant chain, the risk have completely changed. So your program needs to change as the business changes. And then I think the other thing is, we've talked a lot about key stakeholders in your organization. You've got to make them resilience advocates or champions. A lot of people treat what we do as an audit function. And if you come in and tell people what they have to do, 1, they're going to push back. And 2, they will do the very bare minimum. So if here's what I need to do to get you off my back, I'm going to come in right just above it. You make someone an advocate, you show how what we do helps mitigate risk for their department, for their business unit. They'll go out and do the work for you. That kind of connectivity and that relationship building, I look for that more than some of the technical skills, because I can teach you the technical skills faster than I can teach you relationship skills.
And the final question I always like to ask people is, if you could have one wish and something you could resolve in the security or resiliency space, what would it be?
All right, so you're the genie and you've got the lamp.
You've got the lamp, you've got one wish.
Well, I'm going to go with an easy. I would love to know the date and time of any incident. I would love it was on my calendar that we're going to have a flood on Friday and we're going to have ransomware on Wednesday. Just imagine how prepared you could be and how seriously everyone would take your planning. You'd be like, okay, remember, it's like with children when they're studying, like, okay, you have a test on Friday. And I could say, okay, we've got a tornado on Friday, so we have to get this done.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite to what you said earlier, is don't let people plan, but it'd be lovely to plan.
Well, now you pulled out the genie and the lamp, so now I'm switching my position.
No worries. Well, thanks, James. I really appreciate it. if our listeners want to learn more from you, where's the best place to reach out to you? Is there any websites or LinkedIn? Where's the best place?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn under James Green, and you can find us at illuminateadvisory.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Matt.